Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting a scenery using only one color, which is good practice to focus more on values and also composition without colors getting in the way. So to start, I'm just going to mask the side of my paper like usual, and after that I'm just going to pull the tape backwards to secure the paper with my watercolor pad. Then once I'm done, we're going to go straight into painting. I'm going to begin by wetting the paper. I'm going to just dampen the whole page evenly while avoiding puddles. You can also use a larger brush to do this to make the process quicker. For this painting, I'll only be using Indigo by Schmincke, but you can also use other dark colors as well, so you have a huge range in values. Once I'm done, I'm going to activate the paint and use a medium consistency to start at the bottom because I want the bottom to be the darkest area. Then I just pulled a bit from the bottom upward, so I painted the sides first with a lighter value. Then I slowly pull it to the middle, so the bottom is the darkest, the sides is the second darkest, and the middle is the lightest. Because the surface is wet, the paint will start merging together, so I'm going to add more indigo still in a light consistency around the sides to give a vignette to the painting. While the surface is still wet, I added a thick consistency around the bottom as bushes, and I help the paint move by tilting my paper. Then I'm going to follow this up with a medium consistency to paint more bushes on top of the one I painted earlier, but in a slightly lighter consistency this time because the bush is further at the back. If you want, you can also place the bush in different positions as well and customize your composition. Here I'm just going to show you how I painted mine as reference if you would like to follow along. I started at the lower part of the bush and built upwards because I wasn't sure how far to the top I want the placement of the bush to be, but as I add more to the top, where in perspective the distance is further, I space out my blobs that I create with my brush, so when the paint settles, it'll be lighter than the bottom area. At the moment, the position of the bush is quite far back or quite high, so I'm going to add another layer this time in a slightly thicker consistency, just a little bit on the right hand side to place in the middle of the bushes that I painted earlier. The paper is still a bit damp but not as wet as before, so now I'm just going to start painting the trees for the background. I use a medium to thin consistency for this, and I'm just going to paint a few thin tree stems with fine branches. For this, I'm just going to play around with the height and the position of the branches so it looks natural, and I also made sure that the bottom of the trees are thicker than the branches. After I've painted a few small trees, I'm going to use a slightly thicker consistency and paint a larger one that is closer to the view. So for this one, I made it a bit thicker and a bit darker, and I'm also going to add leaves by just dotting it with my brush as the surface is starting to dry. Since the surface is almost dry, the texture of the leaves that I'm painting here is a bit more visible, but at the same time, because it's not completely dry yet, as we wait for it to settle, the leaves will still blur out slightly with the background. When I'm painting the leaves, I want the load on my brush to be fairly dry, because if it's too wet and the surface is almost dry, the very wet paint will bloom, which creates an outline of the wet paint as it dries because they're going to dry at a different rate. For the leaves of the larger tree, I want to use a thicker consistency while repeating the same application by just tapping with my small brush because I want these leaves to be closer to our viewpoint, just like the tree. I think the background is quite filled already and I want to start layering on dry surface, so I'm just going to speed up the process by using a hairdryer to make sure that the paper is completely dry. Once the surface is completely dry, I'm going to tackle the bush in front. I'm using a thick consistency to paint the bottom, and as I get towards the top of the bush, I want to use a dry brush consistency so I can create textured edges. After I pick up the paint, I dry the excess off with my tissue, and I also try to flatten my brush so parts of the bristles open up to use for the textured edges. Next, I'm going to paint more bushes at the back using the same technique, but this time in a lighter consistency. Though the paint is more watery, you can still dab off the excess on tissue. Then I flatten my bristles just like before to create more of those textured edges for this bush as well. I realized I wanted to darken some parts of this bush because it's looking quite light, so I just layered on using the same technique, but this time, because we used a dry brush load for the initial layer, you can paint straight on top without it blurring, since it doesn't take long for the previous layer to dry. With whatever pigment was left on my brush, I just smeared it at the top of the previous bush to create more in an even lighter value and just help it spread by using a bit of water from my damp brush. Now in a medium consistency, I'm just going to add more textures between the bushes that I've already painted, and I like to also heighten the length by creating thin vertical textures. Now I want to start building the tree on the foreground. I'm using a medium to thick consistency and a medium load for this. I also switched to my larger brush at this point because it's much easier to create a thicker line weight to create this tree. So firstly, I begin by painting the tree trunk, and then I'm going to build on the branches using the same brush load and also the same consistency paint. After I'm done, I'm going to go back in with a medium consistency and paint another large tree behind the tree in the foreground to start building the depth of the painting. When you do this, you want to make sure that the darkest tree is completely dry first. If not, the two trees might end up merging together if they're both wet, which will ruin the depth that you create from the different values. Don't forget to also paint the branches behind the tree and the foreground to help with the depth of the painting. There's a little bit of space on the left, so I'm just going to add another tree and I'm just going to create a straight line for that. Next, I want to move on to the right hand side. I'm going to switch to my smaller brush for this because I want the tree on the right to be thinner and smaller. I'm using a medium to thick consistency for this, so the color is fairly dark, and I also want the branches of this tree to be very narrow and shoot straight upwards instead of to the side. For the bottom of the tree, I just added more bush texture with the same consistency, so the tree doesn't look like it's floating. After that, I'm going to continue adding the branches, but this time I'm going to switch to my liner brush so I can create even finer branches, and I can also make them closer together at the same time. To fill in the space on the right hand side, I'm going to add two more trees. I'm using a slightly lighter consistency and I'm going to just paint the same type of tree. For this one, I'm going to extend the trunk downwards and I'm going to add the bush texture underneath using the same consistency and also add a little bit of those vertical textures as well. Going back to the tree in the foreground, some of the branches have dried and faded a bit in color, so I'm just going to build up the color and also add more finer branches at the same time using my liner brush. going to add a branch that sticks out reaching the trees on the right, but for this one I'm going to attach the branch to the tree behind the foreground so the value won't be as strong, and I feel like this would be less distracting to the composition. Next, I'm going to build on the leaf textures. I'm starting with a medium to thick consistency, and I'm going to place these leaves to the tree on the foreground. I'm just tapping using the tip of my brush while directing my brush differently to depict the leaf textures, and as I'm painting, my brush will run out of paint and the color will become lighter in value, and when that happens I move to the right hand side to add leaves for the trees behind. By now you should be able to catch on that I'm placing the stronger darker colors for the trees or the elements closer to our view, and as it gets further at a distance the color becomes lighter and fades. So this is something that you can control, especially for the leaves. I like to play with different values at the same time, but I just place them strategically so it suits the composition. For the darker trees I add darker leaves, and for the lighter leaves I add lighter leaves, but at the same time, because the branches can also reach forwards towards us, some leaves on the lighter trees can also be a bit darker here and there. There's quite a lot of leaves to add on here, so I'm just going to keep doing that before we move on to the next step. I have quite a lot here already, so I think I'm going to leave it for now and move on to the next step. I want to add more branch textures in the foreground, so I'm just using a thick consistency with my liner brush to add smaller branches, and I'm also going to add lighter ones at the back as well. Here I'm just thinking of filling up the empty spaces, so it's completely up to you and it depends on your composition where you want to add these on. The main idea is basically the same as the leaves that we painted earlier, so the thicker the consistency or darker the values are placed at the front and the lighter values are placed at the back. I'm also going to add leaves to the smaller branches as well, and because I'm painting the ones on the foreground, I'm using a very thick consistencies to make it more visible. Going back to the leaves for the tall trees, I felt like the leaves at the back looked too sparse, so I'm going to use my larger brush in a thin consistency to fill in more of the space and add the density of the leaves. I feel like I have enough going on in the composition, so now I'm just going to adjust little things like the values to further balance out the composition. So on the left, I want to add darker leaves, and I also want to build the value further for the tree on the right so it doesn't blend too much with the middle ground and foreground. I just basically use a thick consistency and just paint right on top of this tree as evenly as I can, covering as much of the stem and the branches, especially at the bottom, but for the finer branches at the top, it's okay to leave it a bit lighter. At the bottom, I felt like adding some dust particles or just extra added textures, so I added splatters only to the bottom of the composition. After that, I feel like the painting is done, so I'm just going to unmask the sides and clean out the edges with bleed-proof white. And that's pretty much it. This is the completed painting. There are some things that I still need to work on, but overall, I think this was a good exercise for me, and I hope that it's good practice for you guys as well. Like usual, the list of tools that I used for this painting, as well as my social media links, will be in my description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!